Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Ben Kinsley is joining us tonight, co-host and co-producer. Ben, how are you?
Good, thanks, Pat.
Yep, and our special guest today is Stephanie Yu, who is a Deputy Director of Public Assets Institute. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thanks
Glad
for
you're
having
here.
Me, yes.
For those of you who might know, the other two folks that Stephanie works with is Jack Hoffman and Paul Silo, who have been around Vermont and Montpelier in particular for a few years. We had Jack on the show about the first year, I think, and just talking about what's going on in Vermont, and I think we talked about the budget because he's sort of a numbers guy.
He is.
He
Definitely a
is,
numbers guy,
yes.
yeah.
But tonight we are trying to tackle something that is, I would honestly say, is a little above my pay grade. It's the benefit cliff. I get the concept, and we're going to ask Stephanie to talk about that, but it's going to be an interesting show, and it's a hot topic in the legislature, we hope. They've got to fix it. But first, could you talk a little bit about you and about PAI?
Sure. So Public Assets Institute, essentially what we do is we look at state economic and fiscal policy, tax policy, but our goal is always to look at it from the perspective of working Vermonters, average Vermonters, low-income Vermonters, and just think about how those things are affecting them. And I think part of what we're trying to do is kind of give that Vermonter perspective. Sometimes we hear about the state budget from the perspective of the governor or the legislature or business or some of that, but we're trying to think about it from Vermonters' perspective.
Well, we appreciate that. Thank you. I think we get forgotten sometimes.
Yeah, and I think the budgeting process can be pretty intimidating to the average Vermonter, for
That's
sure.
right. Absolutely.
We should have them back on about, have you been, not to get off the subject, but have you been looking at the pension liability issue? Yeah, should have you come back.
Lots of numbers there.
That's
Yeah,
another one
exactly.
that's been on the show
I think
more
we've
than
done
once.
2 or 3 shows on that already, and there's
Go on
still
and
more to
on.
talk about. So Stephanie, we wanted to talk about the benefit cliffs, and this is an issue we've been talking about in Vermont for several years now. And could you kind of explain to our viewers what the benefit cliff is and who's most impacted by it?
So the basic idea of the benefit cliff, and it's sort of, there's multiple cliffs because we have different benefit programs, but the idea is that when you earn more money, you lose public benefits and you actually end up worse off. So let's say you suddenly start earning $200 more a month, but you lose $300 in child care assistance. You're worse off than you were before, even though you're working harder and earning more money. So, and there's a couple of points where that happens in Vermont, and it's not particular to Vermont. A lot of it is federal programs. A lot of these programs are. But so the idea is that, you know, that it's a disincentive to work more or to earn more because you actually end up worse off. So, and to get to your question about who's most affected by it, a lot of what we see in Vermont, it comes back to the cost of childcare, right? So we have this childcare financial assistance program. It offers assistance to lower income families, but it's not enough. And so, and the cliff kind of falls off pretty dramatically. So once you start earning more, you really have to weigh those questions of whether it's worth it to take a raise or increase your hours or what that might look like for your family.
Right. You know, and I had that experience. I was telling Stephanie before the show. I was divorced, single parent, and I got child care assistance, just like you're saying. And then I got a promotion at work, and I like, whoa, wait a minute, I got less. And it wasn't dramatic as some of the stories I've heard. So I was able to deal with it because I thought the more you work, the more you're able to build your career up. And that's important too for people that want to work and succeed, right? I mean, they want to build their career up and get known in the company. So do you have, because I was reading all of these examples, do you have some good examples that are not so complicated that maybe you could share with people so they get the idea?
Well, I do think a lot of it comes back to childcare because I think probably we all also know not just families who are relying on public benefits, who need public benefits, but middle-class families for whom there's still a choice. They have 2 kids they're paying childcare for.
Right.
The cost just keeps growing. And the cost of childcare just keeps growing
Yeah,
faster and faster than
Yep.
wages, and so it's really hard to keep up. So if you've got 2 kids in childcare, you know, you really have to weigh. It has to be a really good paying job to make it worth it for whichever adult in the home to work, rather than be taking care of the kids. So, you know, so I think that's really where it comes in the most. And you also, like you say, single parents, 1 child or 2 child. The child care assistance program, it's not enough. Like I say, the cost of child care is just a problem.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have any idea what the normal 1 week of childcare cost a family?
So it depends on the age of the kid. So it really ranges. So obviously infants are the most expensive because they need the ratios
Right,
of the teachers
right.
are the highest. But so the Department for Children and Families does, by every 2 years they do a survey on market rates, and so
Right.
they look at it whether it's a licensed home or whether it's a licensed center or a registered home. They look at the cost. So there's a huge range depending on the age of the kid, but you're talking about $200 to $300 a week.
Oh,
So
and 2
it
kids,
adds
that's
up.
600
It
right out
adds
of your
up
pay. You're
real
lucky if you
fast.
make that.
Yep.
Well, there you go.
Yep. So you're talking about, I mean, I think there's been some studies that have looked at, has it outstripped the cost of college for, and it certainly has
wow.
in some places. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
Oh, my word. Be still
Yeah.
my heart.
It's a difficult issue for sure,
Yeah.
and it's. I mean, childcare is definitely one of the driving factors, but I think there's some cases healthcare also
Yeah,
where
healthcare.
it tails off. I think childcare hits you. When I looked at this a couple of years ago, I think childcare hits you first, and then depending on whether you're a multi-person household or not, then healthcare hits you
Right.
later on. In the income scale, but
Yeah.
both of them are pretty significant tail-offs. They tail off pretty quickly.
Right, so it's a pretty big adjustment. And I think, Vermont was sort of ahead of the curve on expanding Medicaid. We have pretty high levels where, you're eligible, Dr. Dinosaur. But yeah, it's a big problem. And then the subsidies end pretty quickly and the cost of healthcare grows too. So
Yeah.
people end up, not
There
in a
you
great
go.
situation.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, so what are some of, I guess, to go back to, what are some of the issues that this causes aside from, earning more? Is there an impact weighted more towards women and maybe workplace advancement because it's hitting childcare, or is it kind of seen across the board?
So, we look at women's participation in the labor force. We've compared women to men. Vermont has always had a higher rate of women in the workforce than most states, than the national average, for
Yeah,
sure.
yes.
Right. But you certainly see it affecting women more in terms of when the kids are young and at home, there's more of an impact. There's also been a couple studies looking at sort of what is universal pre-K due to women's participation in labor force. You see it ticking up. It's certainly an issue. And again, I think you also see with single parents, oftentimes most of our single parents are mothers. So they're in the situation where, it's pretty difficult to take care of the kids and work when you're the only adult in the family.
Right.
So, you certainly see it having a much larger impact on women.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was wondering if that was going to be the case, just because of where some of the cost drivers were in that tail off. So,
but the flip side of that is also true, which is that we tend to historically value the professions that women are in less. So the cost of them working versus a male partner working, there can be a pretty significant difference if they're the lower earner.
and I can imagine there's
Makes the
probably
case.
career impacts too, because even if you have a multifamily or a two-parent household, and say the wife takes off for 6 months to take care of the kids, and because that infant stage is the most expensive, right? And suddenly then you're 6 months behind in your career,
Right.
and that's got to be, so there's impacts more than just
Yeah.
wages. It's
Well, I
career
think some people,
advancement,
because of the cost, if you have 2 or 3 kids, they've chosen to stay home.
Right.
And so the woman stays home 5, 6 years and then enters the workforce. You're really catching up.
And I don't know if you've looked at, speaking of numbers, if you've looked at the Change the Story VT reports. They did a series of reports on women's participation in labor force, on women's professions and all that. But they also looked at, so what happens to women's Social Security earnings? So
Right.
women who are, 65 plus,
Right.
much more likely to be in poverty than their male counterparts because they haven't had that earning over
That's
the
right.
course of their career.
That's right. Well, that's why I made the decision, even though I had lost some money. I just figured it out because I knew I can't stay home and then go back in 3, 4 years later. I was on a roll. So
Right. But sometimes the families just don't have
Yep.
the luxury of that choice. It's tough.
yeah, right.
That reminds me, this is kind of off topic now, but that same report, the Change the Story report, also prompted changes to rules around independent contractors, because what they found is a lot of women were leaving employment to take care of a child at home, but then still wanted to work from home, and were coming back and working for companies as independent contractors.
Yeah.
And to make it more flexible, they changed some of the employment rules around that so that they could. it
They've
made
never
that
figured
process
that
more-
out, have they? The legislature, independent contractors. I think we've done a few shows on that too. It just never gets solved.
Right.
It's
Right.
it's always out there.
Well, part of it is the enforcement. If we can't do a good job of enforcing it, then
That's
you
true.
can have all the rules you want.
Right,
That's
exactly.
true. And they know how to get around it, maybe.
Well, to get
Just
back to the
saying.
subject we're supposed to be
Yeah, right,
talking
exactly.
about
Benefit
anyway.
cliff.
Sure.
So, you know, we, like I mentioned before, we've been talking about this in the legislature for a number of years, at least as far back as I can remember. This has been a point of conversation. And how is it that we haven't solved the problem, or at least seemingly made progress towards solving the problem?
I think we have made some progress towards solving the problem. With some things like childcare, it used to be much more of a cliff. Now it's more of a slope. So it's a little better, right? But it still needs a lot of work. One issue is, I think, what we were talking about earlier is a lot of it's federal rules. So we can't change the federal rules. So we can only sort of work within them. And each program kind of has these different maps of what gets counted toward your income, what doesn't get counted toward your income, and sort of like, for example, 3 Squares Vermont, which is essentially our food stamps program, takes out the cost of childcare before they're looking at your income. Some programs don't. So there's sort of all these kind of ins and outs of things. So they're really connected to one another. And then what the federal, and the other problem the challenge that states have is there are some things that are easy to change, but then if you change them, maybe you're losing the federal dollars.
Right.
Because that's who is paying for that benefit.
Yeah.
So something like 3 Squares that is all federal dollars. If Vermont makes up the cliff here, but then loses the federal dollars on this hand, it's not necessarily in our best
And
interest.
nobody's
So it's
just in
hard.
one program, right?
Well, I mean,
or at least some of them are
right,
have
there's
several
definitely
different.
some overlap.
Yeah. So how do this is the part that just completely over my head. We don't have the technology, I don't think, to make this all work anyway. I think that's one of the big issues, because we don't do well on big bang projects, I call them, in Vermont. We seem to fail in that regard.
We struggle with
struggle with that, and we don't like to spend the money for them. But I have a list here of some of the programs, and like the 3 Square you said, the Lie Heap, SNAP, it goes, homeowners, renters. So you'd have to take each one individually with all its nuances, and then I don't know whether you add them together or I don't know how you decide how much a person would want. That's very over my head. Maybe that's it.
I think it's a good question to ask, because I don't think anybody has a good answer to this, which is,
I don't feel so bad.
do all the pieces of the puzzle actually add up to what we're trying to do, which is make sure that families can meet their basic needs? Do they all add up to that? Because they are pieces of the puzzle, and they don't fit quite right together.
Right.
So we don't really have a good handle on how well we're doing collectively. But part of it is, here's where the federal dollars come in. So we work around the federal dollars. I think the biggest bang for Vermont's buck in terms of looking at the benefit cliff problem would be to invest more in the child care financial assistance program.
Right.
That's really where a lot of the families are that are hitting this cliff. It's the biggest issue for families.
Okay. And healthcare isn't, as Ben said before, because some families could be dealing with some.
Absolutely.
They've got a special needs child, or something. There's so much cancer in Vermont. I mean, something they're dealing with that could send the cost skyrocketing. What do you do then?
Absolutely, and that's certainly an issue. It just happens to come in further up the income scale. So
Right.
when we're talking about on the child care,
What do you mean?
It's so like the child care one hits in at least when I looked at this a couple of years ago, the $45,000-$50,000 household
Yep.
income range, and then the health care hits in the $70,000 to $80,000.
Okay, I'm going to ask a stupid question. No such thing. Why?
Because the way the federal subsidies work. It's because both of them are federal subsidies. And
Oh, I see. So you get more lower down and less.
yeah, the only exception to that is if it's a single parent household, the healthcare cliff hits you sooner. But proportionally, because you're further up the income scale, it's a proportionally smaller drop than it is for the.
Can we talk
Child
about
care.
my $400 prescription now?
I think that's a different show.
Is that a different show?
for you to talk about with healthcare.
I just was given a prescription. It cost me $400.
Yeah, well, both my kids
I'm
have
just-
EpiPens, so I.
Oh my God, that's
understand.
man.
more. Oh, I take my complaint back. You're ahead of me.
Stress.
Both of them.
Whoa,
Ouch.
yes, that's
And
oh,
they lose things a lot.
That's
so
like
that's another
$300.
problem, yeah.
That's oh my Lord.
You
Go
need
ahead.
to like tie it to their.
Yeah,
It's like we need a
Yeah.
lanyard or one of those whistle keychain
Well, but you
things.
need
go.
it when you
Yeah.
need
Like
it.
those
You
mitten
need it.
strings
The
through their
mittens,
coat.
exactly.
There you go.
Oh my word!
Goodness.
Bless you, Stephanie.
So I guess working on the federal subsidy issue is a tough one, and the healthcare piece of it is almost easier because there's more flexibility for states. But when it comes to the child care subsidies, my understanding is that the state puts in dollars, but then the feds may take back dollars if the states are putting them in?
So we could put more dollars into the Child Care Financial Assistance Program. In fact, the governor proposed doing that this year, and there's a couple of different proposals circulating. So we could put more money in that without necessarily losing federal dollars. We could be doing that. I think the answer to your original question, which is why haven't we solved it yet, is because it costs money to solve. It costs somebody money to solve. And so, and it would be state dollars, because most of these federal programs, like, for example, Reach Up, which is our
Right.
cash assistance program, it's now a block grant, so that number is not going up. Any money that goes into that program is coming from Vermont. And some of the programs, like Medicaid, you have a match situation where some of it's federal dollars and some of it's state dollars. But we could certainly put more money, state dollars, into the Child Care Financial Assistance Program and not lose federal dollars. But it costs money to fill in that cliff.
Right, and
Yeah.
you got to take it from somewhere.
You got to take it from somewhere.
So, has there been any thoughts around a funding source for those, or a couple options that are maybe on the table?
So, well, I think that's part of the question. I don't know if we've really gotten to the point of talking about funding sources. I think a lot of the conversation around the budget in Montpelier revolves around, keeping the budget within the revenues that we have. So, not really
There's a
talking about
concept.
additional taxes, and again, taking it from other places. I think you're still talking about a patchwork system, right? I mean, where are you going to take it from where you're not making a hole over here?
Right.
So.
So it's an interesting, because we talk about all these different programs that we have in place, from healthcare, although healthcare is kind of aside, but Reach Up, childcare subsidies,
3 squares.
You got housing.
3 squares,
Right.
housing
Right.
assistance, all of these different patchwork programs. Is it a better approach just to have a guaranteed base income?
Right.
It's a good question. I think it is that the problem is doing it on the state level, right?
Right.
Again, you come back to this problem of you're going to lose all those federal
All those
dollars.
federal dollars.
Right.
So, I think it's certainly worth exploring at the federal level, but I think as a state, you just can't.
What if you approached it as something like the Medicaid waiver, as something like that, because that's essentially what the Medicaid waiver is doing
Right.
for Vermont, right? Is it's taking all these federal Medicaid dollars and redistributing them into other programs, basically saying we're going to meet your
Right.
benchmark requirements, but
Right.
we're going to do it in a non-standard way. If there was a way to get an agreement like that where you could distribute them more and alleviate some of these, because I got to imagine the feds don't like the fact that there's benefit cliffs either, right?
Right.
If there's
Well,
a
they want people to
disincentive-
work, and
Right.
the governor here has been talking about our workforce and dwindling, and they're there. They want to work, but
Right.
they can't afford it.
Yeah, I think if we all agree that the goal is to make sure that people can meet their basic needs, then how we do it becomes the question. And I think there's a lot to be said for not having all these different programs with the different eligibility requirements, with the different administrative costs, with
Right.
sort of all those pieces. There'd be a lot of interest in that. Again, I think unfortunately it's just not something you can do.
Well, there's been a lot of
At
talk,
state
pro
level.
and con, about the minimum wage increase, and I hadn't thought about it till I started doing this show, and I said, last year, of course, we had S40, and I'm not going to go through all the variations, but it gets up to $15 an hour in 24, and some people are saying that that's actually works in reverse for the benefit cliff. So what is your position on the minimum wage?
Well, any minimum wage increase leaves low-income workers better off in the aggregate. We'd
Agreed.
start
Yeah,
with
right,
that. It
right.
helps people in the aggregate. You're going
Right.
to have some situations where it's complicated. Again, I think what the current bill that was introduced this year
Yes,
has
right.
which is also 15 by 2024. It includes basically shifting the child care eligibility so that it shifts with the minimum wage. So
okay.
the cliff wouldn't get worse, it wouldn't get better,
yeah.
but it wouldn't get worse, because that's what would happen if you left it alone. It would get a
get
little worse.
worse,
But
right.
again, in the aggregate, for all those low-income families, they'd be better off. So you have to take a look at
But sadly, but in the aggregate, there's always individuals or a certain percentage of the aggregate who will get hurt.
But I think a
right?
lot of what the arguments are against minimum wage, none of them have really been borne out in the data in terms of, I think there's a lot of focus on, well, is there job loss and how much job loss is there and what does that look like? And I think, most of the studies, again, they look at the aggregate, people are doing better in the aggregate, but they even look at the individual level, and what they find is that while people do you know, a lot of those studies look at people losing hours. So they
Well,
have
that's
fewer
what
hours.
I think they're afraid of with the minimum wage, that
Right.
people's hours will be cut back.
But the most recent study on that looked at, and what they found that even when you work fewer hours, your income was actually better. So because you're earning more in those hours, you're actually better off.
And people may actually get covered by health care through an employer. That's another plus, right?
There's a lot of, I mean, it's interesting because minimum wage is probably one of the most studied and least understood
Right.
economic principles. And I think the only consensus that I've ever seen on minimum wage is don't increase it too quickly, right? Is really the only consensus out there, is that, you know, you can moderate increases in minimum wage or even large
What's the
increases
rationale
over-
behind not increasing it quickly?
Because employers and
Oh, wow.
employees and benefit programs can't adjust quickly enough.
Right.
But I think where the line is of what's too quick, nobody really knows,
Right.
because all of the increases usually are pretty modest.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
and this is still kind of in keeping with those sort of relatively modest increases,
The
maybe on the
15
high end
to
of the
20,
modest,
yeah.
but pretty modest, like in keeping with what's been done before. In fact, there was just a federal bill introduced, right, to do the federal minimum wage to 15
That's right,
by 2024. So who knows?
Yeah,
Might not
who
be
knows, the
Vermont's
feds might-
problem.
Yeah, right. No, we can blame
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Because I think I'm worried of, because I'm worried of this Vermont is small businesses, and we hear the percent of the, you know, their revenue,
Margins.
you know, it's very tiny, and I honestly don't think the legislature gets how tiny that margin of profit is. It's very small, and it doesn't take much, and then to have it, some of it, what can be absorbed, brought onto the consumer.
Right,
So
and
this-
that's why the incremental increase is
Right,
kind of an important
right.
piece.
So we
is
won't
the-
notice.
And I think it's always, you know, I think business, small or large, is mostly going to resist increases to
Sure,
wages.
'cause
and I
they
think
wanna
that's-
make a profit.
That makes perfect sense.
Right.
But I think the question is, if you believe that there should be a minimum wage, how do you evaluate when it's time to increase it?
Right.
And if you look at sort of all the measures of economic growth, of productivity, of sort of all those pieces, the minimum wage is not keeping up with any of
Right.
those. Even the Vermont minimum wage is
I
not
looked
keeping
at,
up.
I looked, when I was researching for the show, I looked at how the livable wage is how they determine it. And I was laughing because when I came to Vermont, I came from Tarrytown, New York.
Okay.
The two things that hit me in between the eyes about being incredibly more expensive were daycare and food. I went in Bristol, we moved to Bristol, and I did the list you've got that you do every week in your head, and I did
it's on my phone, but
I
yeah.
did my list, and at the end, the woman told me how much. I said, "Oh, you must be wrong," and how to make an impact in town. She actually went through and checked a lot of things, and it was right, and it was way over what I would have paid in Tarrytown because of transportation.
Interesting.
That's the cost. They tell me it's the transportation.
Interesting. Well, we've done some work in this last year. We did some work on looking at prices versus wages in Vermont, and you know, we do an annual report that looks at a bunch of different economic indicators. But one of the things that we found was that prices, which includes food, but also
Right.
includes big ticket items like housing and childcare,
Yeah.
they're actually pretty much at the national average. Vermont prices, but our wages are low.
Right.
Yeah,
The
right.
wages just aren't keeping up, and so
I don't know whether it was just a bad day, but it was many dollars.
I'm sure
over.
there's differences from.
Just,
yeah.
but they were explaining that it was the transportation to get to
Interesting.
Bristol, to get to the middle of nowhere here
Yeah.
in Vermont.
Well,
so.
and it may be true also in smaller communities, like trekking
Right.
costs out to smaller
Right,
grocery
right.
stores is a little more expensive. And
Oh, sure. If you do the mom and pop store, you're paying
yeah.
twice as much almost. So I don't say much about about food stamps here. I keep quiet because
Well, it's kind of funny because to that point, I was down in Nashville in November,
Right.
and we went grocery shopping while we were down there. We were down there for like a week or so, and the fruits and vegetables were actually more expensive in Nashville than they
Really?
were here.
interesting.
Yeah,
You
which
would
is
think the
interesting.
fruits would be they're down the street on a tree somewhere.
You would think
Right.
so. You would think so, but it's just kind of it's a give and take.
Yeah,
you
right.
know? So it's
Bad day in Bristol.
bad. Yeah. So
Yeah.
don't do your grocery
Yeah,
shopping
no,
in Bristol.
exactly.
It's a
That's the
takeaway.
lesson.
Just
That's the
kidding.
lesson.
Nice
There you
town.
go.
I love it.
There you go.
So
But yeah, I think You're right. I think most of the economic research I've seen on Vermont indicates that it's wages that are not keeping
Right.
up with, everything else is kind of on par with national. There's some things that are more expensive, some things are less expensive, but it's,
And it's the type of jobs we have here that just
yeah,
don't pay those kind of salaries.
particularly outside Chittenden County, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, I also think, thinking about what a livable wage looks like, I mean, all these benefit programs come into it too, because even with a minimum wage is really a floor. And when we talk about a livable wage, we're really talking about the cost for a single person.
right.
So then we
Oh,
have to bring in all these other
Yeah, right, the
levers
kids
to adjust
right.
for the family size, right?
Right.
We have the earned income tax credit, we have some of these benefit programs, we have things that to get that family to what sort of a livable income, right? Even though your wages might be the same as the other person making minimum wage, you need to have these other tax credits. You need to be able to hold on to more of that so that you can provide for a
Right.
larger family.
Right.
So there's still a lot of levers in place. Minimum wage is one piece of it that I think could certainly stand to be
Yeah.
brought up.
So that's an interesting question when we're talking about benefit cliffs, because this is one of the levers. As a policy person, this is one of the levers I was looking at as to try to level out that cliff is using an earned income tax credit at the state level to mirror where the benefit cliffs drop for the federal programs, which is kind of in a roundabout way of getting back to parity. The challenge with that, of course, is that it's a tax credit, so you have to figure out.
Once a year.
It's once a year unless you grant it out over a monthly time slot, kind of like what they do with the healthcare
Right.
tax credit.
Right.
So there's a couple intricacies there, but do you think that's a viable option to use a tax expenditure through the earned income tax credit to try to level off those benefit cliffs?
We've been advocating for an increase in the EITC for a while, and in fact, they did increase it this past year, right?
Yep.
In the legislature, they increased it from, the way the Vermont credit works and most state credit works is that it's a percentage of the federal credit.
Yeah, oh,
So whatever
right.
you're eligible for
Right.
at the federal level in
Right.
Vermont, you're eligible for 36% on top
Yep.
of that. And so there's a couple different ways to do it. I think, so we're all for an increase. I think a lot of it has to do with not just an increase in the percentage, but also an increase, you gotta take out who's eligible a little further.
Right.
Those numbers are pretty low. So I think that would go a long way. And one of the benefits of doing it that way is that the EITC doesn't get in the way of a lot of what's considered income for the purposes of a lot of these benefit programs. So you
Right.
don't run the risk of losing federal dollars
Yeah.
or those kind of things. There's also been some interest in like a tax credit that might be specific to families with children, again, to get to this child care
Yeah.
issue. The downside of the EITC and talking about the minimum wage levers is you still have, it's still about what you earn. So there's still going to be families who have barriers to work, serious barriers to work,
Right.
where if we're talking about how to meet these basic needs, again, we're still going to need some benefit programs. Now, it would be great if
Right, didn't.
they were
Nobody-
smaller,
Yeah, right.
but if everybody else had a livable income. But
So has any other states done anything? Like in TANF, I read that there's a couple of states that have really gotten the TANF, which is reach up, reach first, reach ahead, all the reach programs.
the reaching.
They've done something that would help. Of course, that's only one program, but
So the TANF, the federal dollars that come in to reach up, they've tried a lot of different things with them. States really vary in terms of how much of those dollars are spent on cash assistance versus how much are spent on other things. Vermont's not a state that spends a lot of its TANF dollars on marriage incentives, for example, but there are certainly states who do that. So when welfare
what's that
reform,
number for kids and help if you have
there's some
kids?
there's some promotion of marriage as
really?
yeah.
Interesting.
So that's allowable by the federal rules.
Huh.
But so welfare reform, that was part of it. We made, we turned what was aid to families with dependent children, AFDC, in the mid-90s. This was all under Clinton, the welfare reform process. We turned it into basically a block grant to states, but then there was some more flexibility in what they could do with it. And some states put a lot into cash assistance, some put not that much. We put a fair amount into childcare as well as cash assistance. But there is some flexibility with that, but the bottom line is that the dollars are capped.
Oh.
So even sort of creative use of those dollars doesn't, I think, go quite far
When I was
enough.
in transportation, we used to try to get the feds to just give us X bucks and let us do, because they would put requirements on every dollar, and sometimes we needed it here, not here. And I think in this case, if they just gave us and hold us accountable and have performance measures and They're never going to do that, are they?
I think you said it
Never.
right. That the devil's in the details, or
Yeah.
the devil's in the strings, right? Like, what are the strings that go with
Right.
it? So
Yeah, there's every dollar is, you got to use it for bridges, for roads, for, but our, I don't know, our waters and streams need fixing.
Right.
So give us the money and we'll do it and we'll all be happy.
They got a little creative last year where they were able to redirect some federal funds.
Yeah,
for
there's
roads
things you
into-
can do, but
Yeah.
just give us the bucks and let us perform.
well, it comes back to the question of what the intent is, right? If
Right.
the intent is to allow you flexibility, great. If the intent is for everybody to spend less money, sometimes it's not as effective.
That's so great.
That's how it goes.
That's right. So I think we were talking a little bit about livable wage before. Some people say the minimum wage is not the way to go. Is the livable wage a way to go? Is that something we should take seriously? I know we've talked about it a lot. That and the happy quotient, which is another topic.
Right. Right.
Which is,
Happy.
well, it's an interesting sorry,
Happiness
this is-
index.
Happiness
Yeah,
index
happy
is what
index.
the UK uses to determine
Really?
government effectiveness.
Oh
Yeah.
my.
It's an interesting concept.
That's
Not
a-
recently.
that's a
we're
big
watching
ask of
some
government.
Yeah, it's a big
exactly.
ask of government. Yeah.
Exactly.
But-
But so what is the? I mean, we've
Livable
got the
wage.
livable wage, the minimum wage.
Right.
What's the right thing?
So there's an official Vermont livable wage that the Joint Fiscal Office puts out every 2 years, and right now I think it's around $13.30, $13.34, somewhere in there. That was the 2018 number. But again, it's the floor for a single person, what that would look like. And then there's a series of, they look at what the basic needs budgets would be depending on your family size.
Right.
And so then the wage is different accordingly. How much you need to earn depends on your family size. So so we certainly believe that the minimum wage should be a livable wage. I think that, there is some idea that the minimum wage is entry-level jobs, it's teenagers working in the summer or whatever,
Right,
but in
right.
fact, not the case in Vermont. The average person making minimum wage is 38. We have more women making
Really?
minimum wage. We have the majority of them are the breadwinners in their household. Many of them have children. So I think that stereotype of this
Wow.
minimum wage as, kind of entry-level is not quite right. And that makes a big difference. So when we're talking about a livable wage, we are talking about whether or not people can afford to support their
So
families.
just the average person making a minimum wage is 38 years old. We got to get that right. That's something that should be.
That's crazy.
I'm blown away by that number.
And
Why don't we make that more known?
And the other piece of it is because Vermont is a pretty well-educated state, we have a larger share of people with bachelor's degrees who are making minimum
So we
wage.
must have some
Quite
kind
a
of
few.
gap there. That's staggering, probably, right? Isn't there? There must be a gap between
gap in-
minimum wage and the next level up of income.
Well, this is one of those. This is an interesting topic. This is kind of going back to economics, right? Is that we have, because our unemployment rate has been so low for so long, and we've been saying this for years now, is that we have an issue. We have an issue where there aren't enough available jobs to fill the workforce, and we don't have jobs that are high skilled. So we've been saying that for years, and then the workforce is also not reflective of the jobs that we have available, right? So there's less movement from inside the workforce from jobs that are low skill to high skill.
So we've tried to look at this a lot, and we've had a really hard time nailing down the right data to address the question of how real is the skills gap. And we just don't know. We feel like you hear a lot of anecdotes in the State House and elsewhere that employers can't find the people they need to fill the jobs. And we have a tough time measuring how true that is. Certainly perception matters in a case like this. But I do think part of the question is there really a mismatch? And does that have to do with our education system, our job training systems? Or is there not really a mismatch? It's just that it's kind of been an employer's market for a while. Despite low unemployment, we haven't seen wages increase much. Normally that's what you would expect as unemployment goes down, and that hasn't happened. So is it that employers aren't willing to pay enough in wages? Is it that, is it a skills gap? I mean, I think it's really tough to know.
Well, yeah, I think it could be a couple things, and this is probably why people have had such a hard time nailing it down, and there's probably a few things at play, right? We clearly have an above average skilled labor force. We have more skilled workers than is typical. But I think the real question is, are those skilled workers in the right fields? where the available work is, right? And then the second piece of that is, are underskilled, or excuse me, overskilled workers, so workers who are have more skills than the job that they're in currently, aware of other opportunities.
Right.
And I think that's, you know, one of the challenges for just the business community in Vermont in general is I have a lot of friends that work in workforce and talent recruitment, and the problem with a lot of Vermont businesses is they're not looking broad enough to find skilled workers, and I've heard this over and over again. Again, it's anecdotal, but you know, there very well could be skilled workers that could fill that open position or those types of open positions in Vermont, but they're either not looking, or the business doesn't know where to look for them.
Interesting.
Yeah, the other thing I would add too is the types of jobs that we've been adding since the Great Recession have tended to be concentrated in the service sectors.
Yep.
So we are, you know, which
Not
tend to pay
technical.
less.
Yep.
So, and tend to be less skilled positions. So there is that increase, and that's part of the question too, is where, you know, where is the demand, and you know, skills obviously is a huge range of what, you know, the industry and the type of skills
Because we've
you
lost
might
a
have.
lot in manufacturing.
Right.
I mean, big time. I know AIV has talked about how many members have not here anymore.
Right.
So that's bad.
Well, manufacturing is in
That's where the money is.
the U.S. as a whole is.
Right.
Yeah,
It's not a
right.
Vermont-specific problem.
Right.
Yeah, it's not a Vermont-specific problem,
Yeah.
and that's been true across the country in terms of service jobs are the ones that we're adding back. You know, you are seeing some growth in technology, but you know, even though dollars-wise it's driving a lot of value, it's not driving the number of jobs, the number of positions.
So just as the minimum wage goes up, which I'm assuming this bill is gonna pass, then we look back and kind of revisit the benefit eligibility to sort of keep it on par, or does that make it worse if they do that?
I think that's right. I think, so again, the current bill has this adjustment of the eligibility for the child care assistance. So I think that helps. So at least it's maintains the position. It doesn't solve the benefit
Right.
cliff, but it doesn't let it get worse. So yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about where what we could do. I think tax credits are, you know, would be a great thing to explore. Again, you know, a lot of the federal programs, there's not a whole lot we can do to change the eligibility on some of this stuff. Certainly with our Reach Up dollars, we could change what we're spending them on to some
Reach Up
extent.
is a great program. One of the departments in state government is at one point had almost a majority of Reach Up people, and they got off the program and become very successful state employees, and you know, went on to do great things. It's a great program for teaching people the skills they need.
Yep, there's a lot of options for that in terms of integrating into the workforce. Yeah.
So I skipped to I had the livable wage thing. If you guys are pushing that, who are you pushing it to? What committees do you go in front of a lot, and who is paying attention there?
So right now the minimum wage bill is in Senate Economic Development, and so they're working on that. So the livable wage conversation does come up when the Joint Fiscal Office puts out this basic needs budget every couple of years. We look at that. There's a bunch of different calculators across the country. MIT has one, the Economic Policy Institute has one. And we just kind of triangulate, you know, the Joint Fiscal Office does this one, which is, you know, they're all looking at regionally specific, Vermont specific, you know, what does it really cost? What does a family really need? And, you know, they're all in that ballpark of, you know, $13 to $15 as sort of a floor for a single person. So, you know, I think the conversation is happening. I think there's a whole bunch of levers you would want to look at. You would want to look at EITC. You would want to look at, I mean, the paid family leave comes into this. We were just talking about the cost for infant child care is the most expensive.
Right.
If we had better paid family leave, we wouldn't, you know, that cost would be taken out. So, we're not all state workers who can bring our babies to work, but you know, there's different options.
That's a new policy.
It's a new policy.
I heard that.
So glad I'm home.
Doesn't sound
Nobody
very
asked
productive,
me.
but maybe my babies were more difficult than others. I don't know.
The dog, maybe yes.
No, I bring my dog to work. I don't know.
Do you? Oh, I wish I could.
There you go.
Which are plenty distracting as they are, but you know.
Right.
So the a couple of thoughts, because this all interplays, right? This all intertwines when you start really looking at it. Because at the end of the day, what it is, you know, we talk about I hate using this word, but affordability, right? And affordability, in one way, maybe you could rephrase it as livability, right? At the end of the day, is really what do you have left over after your take-home pay, your mortgage, your food, your child care, anything
Disposable
else.
income, as they call it.
Disposable income at the end of the day is what it's about. What can you,
My makeup, that's
how much do you have left over after all of your expenses are paid? After all your basic expenses are paid. And there's a whole bunch of levers that, as the federal government and state government, that we try to pull to get that number, to increase that number, right? I think we've created this huge tapestry of state and federal programs to try to address it, and benefit cliffs are one of the, I wouldn't say unintended results of that tapestry of programs. So when we talk about livable wage, that's kind of I guess it's not really inverse, but it's the same concept, right? Of getting to what can people actually live on,
right?
And so how do we get to that? Using minimum wage as one of those levers, right? They may get you to a single family or a single person income earner.
How I live? I mean, $13,000. That's
or $13 an hour.
Oh no, didn't you say 13,000?
Sorry, it was $13.34 an hour.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah,
Oh,
for a
well, that's
full-time
not
wage
much.
earner.
Yep.
Still, not a lot.
Yeah, no.
Still not a lot.
Really?
That's still.
Yeah.
26,000 a
I
year.
was gonna say less than 30. Yeah.
Right.
So maybe that's a single income earner with no kids. But then even with two income earners, maybe you don't necessarily need to make that much, but then you start adding kids into the equation, and then you need to make more than that. So, a single income earner with two kids, that's there's no way $13 an hour is going to be enough. Or
Right.
There's no way $15 an hour is going to be enough. So what other policy levers? Because you can't
make the employer
pay
Yes.
based on the number of kids that you have. Like that's that's
Be like Japan says you can only have. They put a
China.
limit on
China
is
too.
it? Oh, that's right.
The
I'm
one
sorry,
child
China.
policy.
You can only
Yeah.
have 1.5 kid or something.
1.5
That's it.
exactly. Yeah, which we don't want to go there.
Yeah,
But
right, yeah.
so
Talk about
so
wanting to get
Yeah,
population.
right.
I'm not sure that's what we want to do to our
Exactly.
birth rate.
Exactly.
So the EITC, and there's some other things that you can do. The child care credits are ways of leveling that off, right? Is there a way to make that system more simple?
Simple is the hard part. I mean, you're right. There are a lot of moving parts, and I think one of the parts that is moving is that it changes over the life cycle of the family.
Right.
What they need.
Right,
It's because in any given family, your full-time child care costs are concentrated at a certain period, and then that's over. And maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, whatever that period is. So that shifts quite a bit. I think what you're getting to is the right question, which is how are we getting people to meet their basic needs? And there are a lot of, like you say, there's a lot of levers, and I'm not sure. I don't think you can just do one thing and cure it all, right? I do think you're going to need these different levers because we need different programs for people who do have barriers to work.
Right.
We're going to need to still provide, for their basic needs one way or another, and then you do need some investment when you're paying for full-time childcare. I think it's safe to say that our business model for childcare is not working. Childcare workers are barely paid, they're certainly not paid a living wage.
Yeah.
And, and parents are paying all that they can pay. So, part of that is thinking about it maybe the way we think about public education as a public good. It's good for everybody if we have good preschools. That, makes a big difference.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of pieces to look at. I also guess I would, when I think about affordability or livability, I'm also thinking about the ways in which, government can bring your wages up, they can set a minimum wage, but they can also do something to make your costs more affordable. So things like investing in the child care system make your costs more affordable. And something like paid family leave, which is, the current proposal is designed as an insurance program. Everybody puts a little bit in, spreads the cost. It's something that only really government can do because you're spreading it across so many people. So, I think government does have to be the solution to to a lot of these, and figure out what the right levers are that make sense.
Of course, I just read an article yesterday, I think it was just on Facebook, that there's so many requirements now for people in daycare. They have to have a degree. So a lot of daycares are just closing because it's just mom trying to open up a daycare center for herself. And
Yep, there's been a lot of proposals to try and help with the cost of education. If you're going to set these standards,
Right.
then how do you get people to be able to meet them? And it's not easy, and it's a huge range. And these are such, I'm sure you experience this
Yeah.
as with your kids. These are such personal decisions.
For sure.
Your daycare choices
Yeah,
for your
right,
kids, where you're leaving them when they're
That's
babies.
right.
So it's a complicated question.
Yes, it is.
For sure.
And here's,
Yeah.
speaking of employers, that's where I usually, so you do a livable wage, you do an increase in minimum wage. Start a job, I get $15 an hour. Ben's been in the same company 3 years making $15 an hour. So he goes, hey, you just brought somebody in for new, so the owner presumably has got to increase Ben's wage, and it could go straight up the ladder. And a lot of money for the employer, wants to keep the employees happy. What do they do about that?
So I think that is part of the reason for the sort of gradual process.
Right.
And you do see a lot of the minimum wage studies will look at kind of who's directly affected, as in who's making less than $15 an hour
Right.
now, but then they also look at kind of that layer above, who's
Right.
indirectly affected, because generally those people do see their pay bumped up somewhat.
Yeah, for sure.
But you also see a compression across businesses. So you do see that, some of this is, there's just not as big a range. There's sort of more of a squished range.
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily see everybody kind of shifting upward. You just kind of see the range get a little bit more
But it is
squished.
still more money
But
for
it's-
the employer to deal with,
Sure.
to absorb. Yike. Glad it's not me.
Well, it tends to be smaller service-oriented businesses.
Yeah,
Anyway,
sure.
they're not talking about large corporations where they're, it's still, payroll is still going to be their largest expense by far, but it's not where you have multiple levels of management and you have multiple levels of income earners. It's typically one or two levels where you have a manager
Right.
maybe, and then your frontline workers, whoever they are, whether it's a server or a waiter.
Assembly line or something, right?
Right. Those are the ones where maybe you don't give your manager a raise next year, but your waiters get a raise or something like that.
And the other piece of it too is, for every increase in the minimum wage, you do see a decrease in turnover. So that does make a big difference
That's
in terms
true.
of people
That's
are going to,
true.
there
Yeah.
does tend to be much more churn
Right.
at low wage jobs. So
Right.
if you made that into a livable
They'll
wage, you
maybe
do
stay.
see a reduction in that churn.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's a savings. So
Yep.
you're not training new employees
Yep.
and that stuff, and the errors that come along with the new
Yep.
employee.
Yep.
So is there a state that makes this all work? Because I would think if you finally get all of these plans to work together, you'd have to have us report in every 6 months, every year, any adjustments like we do on healthcare at the end of the year. If you've had a child or something, this constant
Yeah.
calculating. And I could just see another really big department.
So I wish that there was a state who had figured this all out. I think there are states that are more along on different aspects of this than
individual
others.
programs?
But I think Vermont has also been kind of a leader in a lot of these ways.
Really?
The Medicaid waiver stuff, we've been ahead of the curve on.
Right.
Medicaid expansion, we've been ahead of the curve on. So I do think that that there's a lot that we're doing where the EITC, we do have a good EITC. I think it's worth looking at how we expand the eligibility and the amount, but it's more robust than a lot of state EITCs. Not every state
And
has
that's
one.
employee income tax credit?
Earned income tax credit.
Earned income tax credit. Right.
So it's a tax credit back on your.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one too, because I think the state has a lot more flexibility with that. If you could restructure it in a way that is not just giving that back once a year,
Right.
kind of like the way that the Affordable Care Act, the ACA tax credit works,
Right.
and then maybe match your eligibility and benefit back to match that up with where the benefit cliffs are.
Yep.
So
Yep.
you can smooth some of those out. It's not going to be perfect,
Yep.
but it may be a way of helping to get people back to zero at least.
Yep, I think that's right. And especially if you can, like you say, if you can spread it over the course of the year, so it actually does help people with their monthly expenses.
Right, because that's
the
what it
key.
comes back to, is like if you're getting that once a year, the tendency, just because I will pick on it, but you see all of these, car dealers that are running commercials in
Trying to get your tax
February and
refund.
March, trying to get them to spend your tax refund
Yes,
on
right,
a new
good
car.
timing.
Right, well, and they do it intentionally.
Check in hand, right?
Right, they know people just got a
Right,
check for
right.
a few hundred, few $1,000s, and it's like, oh, spend that on a car. Go get a new car. And the problem with with tax credits that are intended to level off expenses is that's the tendency, is to go spend it, blow it all in one, and then forget, oh, I actually need this for the rest of the year for expenses or
like to
whatever.
Well,
my
I think
bills.
part of it is also it's hard to get out of, if you're behind all the time and you have debt to pay off when that check comes in, it's hard to get ahead of that.
Right.
You kind of get stuck in these spirals where it's really hard. So I think, it's not just about, buying a car, but it's also about if you have been falling behind because you haven't had enough for your monthly expenses,
Right.
There's always
Robbing
demand.
Peter
There's
to
always
pay Paul.
demand for that
Yeah,
money.
Yeah.
Mhm.
We've been talking about this, Ben said, for years.
Mm-hmm.
So where is this on the old priority list? Because it would answer the governor's concern about workforce. Because if we can encourage these people to go to work and to stay working, it should be a priority. But I think how to make it all work is. I see a summer study coming on.
Right. Well, the Minimum Wage Study Committee last summer did do some work on benefit cliffs and really.
Oh, who was on that?
So Senator Sorokin, I'd have to remember who all the members were, but Senator Sorokin led it, and but they took a lot of testimony. This was before they did the minimum wage bill last
Right.
year. They wanted to understand all these
Right.
sort of pros and cons and
Right.
influences on it. So they spent some time on the benefit cliff and really looked at it. And I think, again, the recommendation is to fix the child care assistance eligibility, but there's just a lot more work to do to figure out how to
Right.
solve the benefit cliffs. And I think part of it is a conversation with the feds. What's allowable, what's not
Right,
allowable,
right.
what would work in terms of a tax credit that, wouldn't hurt eligibility for
But
these
if
other
we
federal
tackled
dollars.
just one, and if you think the child care would have that much of a dramatic impact, maybe that would spur us on to do others.
It would be progress,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Mhm.
Because Sorokin's a very thoughtful. I've been in his committee recently, and he's very thoughtful.
Yeah.
He's a good chair.
Yeah.
I don't know him that well, and I was very surprised. He's very thoughtful. So there you go.
He'll consider all opinions.
Yeah.
I think it's a challenge. There's a couple ways to go at it, and hopefully they figure it out.
Write that check.
Right.
Well, they've got so many things to deal with, and we were just talking about the pension, and
Yep.
how do you make those decisions? But this one's got a lot of benefits to it. If you fix it, you're helping, first of all, the state and employers, but you're helping individuals feel responsible and feel that they're accomplishing and something and giving to the community and all that stuff.
I
which
think
is
that's
great.
right. I think it's thinking less about the immediate upfront cost and more about the long term,
right.
what that does for people. So if people have their basic needs met, it means a lot more.
I agree with you. Yeah,
freedom
and we
down
didn't
the
even
road.
talk about transportation, and the housing issue is huge. I think there's a lot of discussion going on now about housing, which is a good thing, because we were talking about attracting families to come to Vermont to take jobs. They can't find places that they want to move to and live in. So it goes on forever.
And you mentioned clean water and pensions. I
right.
mean, both of which are costs that we know we have that we keep pushing out, and
Yes.
they end up
Oh, yeah.
costing us more down the road.
That
And
water
that's
thing,
something that's important that people need to understand, because we've talked about, people talked about the pension as a liability, right? We haven't, at least I haven't, heard people talk about the lake as a liability, a financial liability.
direct
because-
impact on our economy.
Because it is. It's not, there's an economic impact, there's an environmental impact, obviously. There's also a liability impact, because this is something that the state is mandated by the federal government to fix.
Oh, yeah.
And the longer we put it off, the longer we defer, the more it's going to cost.
Because they have the authority to come in and make us. And they've come close a couple of times, and we've managed to skate our way out of it, but they're coming,
Yep.
I think. Is there anything, we have a couple of minutes left, is there anything we have forgotten to talk about on this subject that you'd like to let people know about? Or things they could read, or?
It's a long list. I mean, if people are interested in the long reports, there are definitely some out there. Like I say, the Minimum Wage Study Committee did
Right.
do this. They included a section on benefit cliffs. There is there are some benefit cliffs. We love charts at Public Assets. We always are using charts. So if you want to see some of the visualization of some of this, which I think helps in terms of seeing, what each benefit does or adds to a family's security, how that looks. I think there's some great charts out there that kind of give you a better idea of how to visualize it. So it's worth it, to check out some of those. I think again, you start with the premise that we're trying to meet people's basic needs, and then, we can argue about where that basic need line is. We can argue about what that looks like, but I think, start
Well,
from
do
that
me
place.
a big favor. You all have to work really hard in getting that number out of 38. That is
startling.
just startling.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
people will be as blown away as we are to hear that. I've never heard that before, ever. That is a staggering number. 38 years old, average minimum wage.
And we have one of the highest rates of people with bachelor's degrees making minimum wage. Yep.
Whoa.
It's not what you think. Yeah.
Well,
It's not
I'm
what you
serious.
think.
I mean, that would help the discussion. I think if people understood the context, because we all think it's kids
Yeah.
starting out, and why should they
Yep.
not have, why should they have $15 an hour? It's just starting and learning and progressing.
Well, and that's maybe what it was 20 years ago, but
Not anymore.
Right.
yeah, but that story has changed.
Yep.
I think another thing on minimum wage, like a couple minutes
Yeah,
left,
a couple
but
minutes.
Vermont has an indexed minimum wage to economic growth, so it increases in proportion to economic growth
Oops, sorry.
year over year. This is really what the phased-in approach is doing, is essentially just accelerating that.
Right.
Right.
Because I think I looked at this again a couple of years ago, but if we had, a consistent economic growth for the
Like
next
3%.
Right.
yeah, we would hit that by 2030 anyway.
Yeah.
So
Well,
we're accelerating.
this
it by a
bill
few
has the
years,
cost
but
of living adjustment
Right.
once we get to
once we get back to that.
back to 15
Back to
in
15.
24.
Yeah.
That's where it is now.
Yeah.
One thing we didn't talk about at all is the tipped minimum wage, which is a whole
Oh,
other can of
yeah.
worms. So
Yeah,
we
which
could
is a
get into
whole
if we
other
wanted
thing.
to.
Yes,
The bill this year and last did have a carve out actually for our secondary school students. So secondary school students are not subject to the $15 minimum wage. I think it's whatever the minimum
Oh,
wage is minus
interesting.
$3.
Oh.
So it does get to that teenager thing. If you're a teenager
Yeah.
and you're still in school, then the employer is not subject to it. But
So
the
that
other,
would go back down to 12,
so it would be 12 once that's 15.
and
right?
that's still not tipped.
That's not tipped. Tipped is half. So it keeps up as the minimum wage grows, the tipped grows, but it's half.
So tipped for a secondary student is still half.
I don't know if that's true for the tipped
For the
part.
tip,
That'd
okay.
be a question. I'd have to go back and read the bill and see about that. But I think
That'd be
the
interesting.
general question is what we think of a tipped minimum wage. A lot of states have tipped minimum wage is much lower than where they are. Some don't. Some have,
Okay,
your
so
minimum-
wait. So we're at a restaurant and we give our waitress a tip. She doesn't take that anymore? It goes into
So-
a pot and then it's divided so it meets the law?
No, so she gets the tip,
Okay.
but the rate that she's paid per hour on top of those tips is half the regular minimum wage. So if the minimum
Oh, I
wage is
see.
$10,
Sorry. I
she
got it.
it. $5 an
Yeah.
hour because
Yeah.
the idea is that it's made up in tips,
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
right? So, but there's
So the more we give, the less the employer.
No, it's
No.
still flat.
It's hers.
So the
Or his.
restaurant is paying
Depends
her.
on the restaurant.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the restaurant was in this scenario would be paying her $7.50, her or him,
Yeah,
$7.50 an hour, because that's half the minimum wage.
right.
And then whatever they make in tips on top of that, they keep.
Yeah. Now we started talking about this and we ran out of time. Thank
We'll
you
have to come
all.
back and do another
yeah,
show.
Really,
Yeah,
we
that's
obviously
a whole
done.
nother
Stephanie,
topic.
thank you very
Yes,
much
thank
for
you for
being on
having
the
me.
show. I maybe understand it. I'll have to think about it. Thank you for listening in. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.